In his inspirational message last evening, Ellsworth identified humility as a characteristic of a scientist and a theologian. And our speaker today, Dr. David Wilkinson, embodies this virtue of humility. I wouldn't want to praise him too much for his humble spirit, lest he be tempted to become proud about it, but I don't think I have to fear that too much. I first met David, I don't know if he remembers this, in person on an elevator in the administration building some years ago when he was here on campus at Asbury as a visiting professor. I was impressed with his kind and generous spirit, and our students appreciated his openness and availability to them. Since then, David has taught courses for us online in our extended learning or virtual campus. When we were first invited to participate in a request for a proposal from the Templeton Foundation, David joined us on several occasions from Durham via conference calls in putting together this proposal. I should tell you that Asbury was one out of 30 institutions invited to submit a proposal. 5 were selected. And we appreciate the suggestions that David made to us in those earlier conversations that led us to being one of the 5. Charles Wesley once wrote a hymn for the opening service of the new school in Kingswood in 1748, which John Wesley had founded. And one of the verses in that hymn that Charles Wesley wrote was this: "Unite the pair so long disjoined, knowledge and vital piety, learning and holiness combined, and truth and love let all men see. And those who up to thee we give, thine only thine to die and live." Dr. Wilkinson embodies the best of the Methodist tradition in this regard, as he is helping us to unite knowledge and vital piety. Someone said to me last night, after the evening presentations, that sometimes he goes to conferences to earn CEU credits and would welcome a pillow to rest and sleep on during the conference sessions. But he found this conference to be quite different. And one of the serendipities of this conference has been the inspiration derived from a Christian appreciation of science. Yes, understanding the relationship of science and faith is inspiring. Next year, this student said, or this pastor actually said, "I plan to invite others of my colleagues from Texas to come with me." Well, we appreciate Dr. Wilkinson, and we look forward very much to the fact that people will not need a pillow to take a rest, but will be inspired by what you have to say to us on the subject of engaging faith in science and transformative ministry.
Well, good morning, everyone. Larry, thank you for such a generous introduction. Indeed, after such a generous introduction, I'm quite looking forward to hearing myself speak after that. It's very kind of you, and thank you very much for the kindness of inviting me to this conference, and obviously my personal thanks to the Templeton Foundation for its backing, and may I just thank Carl as well for such a stunning presentation, and for presenting a lot of the material that I was going to try and present, but doing it far better than I did. So in a sense, there's a flow on from what Carl's been talking about, but I want to push it in terms of what it means for ministry. As we've heard the ground so clearly laid out, what does that mean for ministry? I'm conscious that I'm coming from a slightly different context in terms of the conversation that goes on between science and religion. Forgive me, I'll be far too British at times in what happens, but you'll be able to translate as we go along. You know that old story of a newspaper advert. And it had, under the column "Situations Vacant," this advert: wanted, person to work on nuclear fissionable reactor counters and three-phase cyclotronic uranium photosynthesizers. And underneath it had the words, "No experience necessary." Well, my experience would be slightly different, I guess, but hopefully there'll be some common ground as we go along. Let me begin with a short clip from one of the most popular stand-up comedians in Britain at the moment. This is an Irish man called Dara O'Brien, and he, I guess, is one of the 3 or 4 big-selling comedians in the British scene at the moment. This is part of his stand-up show. He comes from a Roman Catholic background. Just see what you make of it.
It's about rules and laws and stuff like that and how I don't do them, right? And bizarrely, the Irish don't do authority and we don't do laws, but we kind of got stuck on the Bible a bit. Now, the thing is, I've said this before, right? I'm not a religious man, right? I don't even believe in God, but still Catholic, obviously. Because I'm not a man for texts and holding to texts really strictly, like laws and rules and regulations. And the Bible thing in particular, for God's sake, we've moved on, right? If you're a religious person, fine, go for that, whatever you're into. But at least in this part of the world, we don't take it literally. There's nobody like there is in America going, no, Genesis is a historical fact. And you go, for God's sake, Genesis was just a load of fairy stories to get the kids to go to bed on a donkey ride to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, right? Stop taking it literally. It's only the Bible. It's not gospel. Not every word in it is supposed to be true, right? For God's sake. And people give out about evolution, right? This wonderful thing that we invented, and we came up with this fantastic theory to explain incredibly complex things. And people go, no, it's not in the book. It can't be right. And other little arguments, creationist arguments like, how could the eye just have evolved? It must be a gift from God. And you're going, no, you're not getting the point. The whole point of evolution is that random things just happened and the useful ones hung around, right? Basically, there were loads of blind monkeys. And then one day, a one-eyed monkey wandered into the middle of it all and rode everything left, right, and centre. And he was king of the monkeys until Mr. Feckin' Two Eyes sashayed into the clearing. It's a wonder I'm not invited to more churches in Alabama to give that speech. But it just depresses people who go, no, God made poof. Poof, there you go, God made us exactly as we are, right? No, of course he didn't, for God's sake. 3 arguments up against that. A, have a look at yourself. If you truly think you were created by God, get out of the shower in the morning and look at yourself for a while in the mirror. This is the same guy, apparently, who made mountaintops and sunsets. What kind of off day exactly was he having when he threw you together? Argument 2, if we were truly created by God, then why do we still occasionally bite the insides of our own mouths? Have you ever felt less divine than when you suddenly go, I seem to have bitten myself on the inside of my mouth? I seem to have chewed at my cheek there. I seem to have forgotten where my lips were. I was so eager to eat that plate of pasta, I've eaten through my own face. Argument C against a divine creator, the appendix. Why would he put it in you when it does nothing except randomly kill you for no good reason? Just sit there doing nothing and then fall apart and kill him. Kill him now!
O'Brien is a very interesting character. He has a degree in astrophysics and is part of the comedic arm of New Atheism. O'Brien and another British comedian, Ricky Gervais, who's become quite popular on this side of the Atlantic, have been doing stand-up shows, picking up some of the culture wars that Carl has been talking about and putting it into stand-up comedy. That's very interesting because it shows a large degree of shared understanding of the conflict model between science and religion. It also shows the way that they interact with Christian faith. And this is the reality that many of us are facing as we minister to congregations. For whatever is said formally and publicly by those who attend our churches, they are being shaped and influenced by the media in lots of different ways. So what I want to do is to ask the question, how might we, in preaching and teaching, in Christian education, chart our way through this? What are the opportunities and challenges that we have in the midst of all of this? One or two things. The first is this. I think we need to take science seriously. And this may not be a plea to those who've come to a conference like this, but it's a plea to the church in general, of which we at this conference can perhaps be salt and light to brothers and sisters in the faith. One of the things that I do on a regular basis is a piece for the BBC called Thought for the Day. This appears on the main BBC news channel, Radio 4, at 7:45 each morning. And you get 2 minutes, 45 seconds to connect the day's news item to the gospel. It focuses the mind somewhat to do this. The audience is around about 5 million at that time in the morning. The BBC has many weaknesses, but it still gives the opportunity for Christians to speak into the public arena in this way. I do a regular piece once a week for a number of weeks on this, but if there's any scientific story, then I'm wheeled out, because bishops can't be trusted with scientific stories. And so I'm wheeled out for the anniversary of Darwin. And last September, I was wheeled out to do a piece on the day that the Large Hadron Collider was switched on. I then went from that 2 minutes 45 to a whole day of going from various radio and television studios to be interviewed on the significance of the Large Hadron Collider. And there were only 2 questions in all of the interviews that I did. The first was, will the Large Hadron Collider produce a black hole which will gobble up the whole of the Earth? A story which was given credence by an animation that appeared first on the internet and then reproduced in a number of news broadcasts. Answer is, of course, not. No possible chance. The second was, would the discovery of the God particle transform our view of theology? The answer is, of course, not at all. I'm sure you know why the God particle is called the God particle. The Higgs boson, this elusive particle that the Large Hadron Collider might possibly find. Well, one of the reasons it's called the God particle is that one of the people who wrote about the Higgs boson in his manuscript, because the search for the particle was so difficult, referred to it as that goddamn particle. The editor, however, said you can't use the phrase goddamn particle for it. Let's call it the God particle. Of course, the discovery of the Higgs boson would be wonderful in terms of understanding the elegance of the laws of physics, but very little would change in terms of our theological understanding because of that. Now, I tell that story of the Large Hadron Collider again because it illustrates a number of things. It illustrates Carl's point about often the media find it very difficult to take science fully seriously, to understand what's going on. But secondly, that within the church we need to be very clear about how we treat science. We need to take science seriously. C.P. Snow talked about this, and I've given you the quote on the handout. Let me just read it. I know that Carl referred to Snow, but Snow had a particular type of prose, which is quite fun. And this is C.P. Snow. A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who by the standards of the traditional culture are thought highly educated, and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I'd asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So that great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. I was doing a conference with a group of 300 clergy the other day, and after reading that quote to them said, now would you turn to your neighbor and explain the second law of thermodynamics? The look of fear on their faces was something to behold. There has been a tendency within theology, within the Christian church, not to take science seriously. But as John Brockman wrote, many literary intellectuals have failed to make any serious encounter with modern science and have lost contact with the wider public through their obsession with the jargon-ridden theories of postmodernism. By contrast, the run-in is now being made by leading scientists who seek to communicate directly with the public audience. Thus, physicists such as Stephen Hawking and biologists such as Richard Dawkins now produce books that sell heavily and which exercise an influence over popular culture. To take science seriously means that I think we need to take time to listen, to learn. It means that we need to take seriously those scientists who are part of our congregation. For how do we get a sense of the feel of science? How do we deal with that issue about how much data you need before a theory commands respect? I sometimes think that we don't give enough voice within our congregations to those who are scientists, technologists, and engineers. We don't give them the opportunity in Sunday school or house groups, or indeed in the pulpit, to talk about the relationship between science and religion. And those of us who are professional theologians don't take science seriously enough. But it also means that I think we have a prophetic ministry in helping our culture understand the nature of science. For Dawkins and others, immediately take the conflict model between science and religion. And yet I think prophetically, there's a sense in which we time and time again have to say there are more ways of understanding the relationship between science and religion than simply the conflict model. And indeed, science has its limits. Science is a very successful activity because it defines the type of questions that it wants to give answers to. There are other questions. I used this illustration yesterday in chapel. Forgive me for those of you who were there, but it's an old one. What is a kiss in scientific terms? A kiss is the approach of two pairs of lips, the reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, and the juxtaposition of two orbicular muscles in a state of contraction. That is a kiss in scientific terms. But if I go to my wife and say, Alison, let me get together with you for a mutual transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes. Let me juxtapose my orbicular muscle in a state of contraction with yours. She would say, get lost. You see, in that context with my wife, a kiss can be described in other ways apart from simply the carbon dioxide and microbes. There are other questions of meaning and value and purpose which go beyond science's ability to understand. So there's something, I think, about taking science seriously. The second thing is this. I think in ministry, we need to move beyond the illustration. In ministry, we need to move beyond the illustration. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, great Baptist prince of preachers, in a very interesting book on lectures on preaching to his students, concludes the book with a chapter on illustrations from astronomy. It's a fascinating read in such a book. And Spurgeon writes this: "It seems to me that every student for the Christian ministry ought to know at least something of every science. God has made all things that are in the world to be our teachers." One or two of you who are theological educators will wonder how on earth you squeeze it into the curriculum. But he goes on talking about astronomy. Again, Spurgeon had a characteristic way of writing. "There is an instance of a brother, a student who seemed to be a dreadful dolt. We really thought he would never learn anything, and that we should have to give him up in despair. But I introduced him to a little book called The Young Astronomer, and afterwards said that, as he read it, he felt as if something had cracked inside his head. He laid hold of such enlarged thoughts that I believe his cranium did actually experience an expansion, which it ought to have undergone in his childhood." Spurgeon uses in that chapter science in two distinct ways. The first is he uses it as an illustration to understand doctrine. So he talks about how you cannot look at the sun directly. It will cause you to go blind. And he uses then the classic preacher's trick, and Jesus is a bit like that. What he says is that Christ is the one who mediates the presence of God to us so that we don't gaze at God directly. Now, however you view that as a homiletic device, that's up to you. But what interests me more about Spurgeon is his second set of illustrations, or his second mode of interacting with science, which is basically to say, look at the universe, look at what astronomy has shown us of the universe, and be excited by it. Be amazed by it. Let your cranium expand to fully interact with the creation as God has created it. So a number of years ago, J.B. Phillips wrote a book, Your God is Too Small. And part of what Spurgeon is doing is using an interaction with science to say your God is too small. I think it's very easy sometimes for us to use science simply as the illustration. But encountering science, taking science seriously, is about expanding the mind, getting excited with the creation as God gave us it. And so let me go on to the next point, which develops from that. And that is the ability of science to stimulate the imagination. This happens in lots of different ways. I showed last night GRB 090423, this object at 13.1 billion light years away from us. And once you begin to play with the vastness of the universe, yes, it goes beyond our experience of millions and billions, but it begins to say that the world is amazing, extraordinary. Not only in pure science, but also in science fiction. Lawrence Krauss, a number of years ago, wrote a very interesting book called The Physics of Star Trek. A fascinating book if you ever want a couple of hours in an afternoon to read. And Stephen Hawking wrote the introduction to this book. He wrote, science fiction like Star Trek is not only good fun, but it also serves a serious purpose, that of expanding the human imagination. It seems to me that Christian apologetics in preaching and teaching is not just about the intellect, it's also about engaging the imagination. So that when Jesus meets a woman by the well in Samaria, he doesn't say to her, my dear, have you ever considered the eschatological dimensions of the atonement? he talks about living water. He talks about the kind of water that will quench every thirst. Here's this woman coming at the heat of the day, backwards and forwards to the well, gets the water, it's gone, goes back and gets more. Jesus is saying, just imagine what it would be like if you had the kind of water to quench every thirst. Or in the previous chapter in John 3, when Jesus meets Nicodemus, do you remember? Nicodemus, you must be born again. And Nicodemus wants to say, well, it's a question of dimensions, Jesus, isn't it? I mean, how can I be compressed to get back into my mother's womb? How can I? No, that's not what it's about, Nicodemus. What's the imagination say, Nicodemus? Here you are, you're a respected leader, a Pharisee, a theological teacher. What would it mean for you, Nicodemus, to start all over again? Just engage the imagination. And of course, John's gospel does this time and time again, doesn't it? It presents the gospel in terms of these great invitations to engage the imagination. The great I am sayings. You can't close those down. I am the bread of life. What does that mean? Engage the imagination. And when it comes to science, science has a way of engaging the imagination, or as John Polkinghorne would say, breaking the tyranny of common sense. So that as you encounter quantum theories, togetherness and separation, the EPR paradox, as you engage the fact that if you accelerate a body close to the speed of light, special relativity says that its mass increases. As you begin to encounter that the world is far more complex, far more subtle, then it begins to stimulate the imagination. It begins to say that this universe and the God who created it is very exciting indeed. So something about stimulating the imagination. The third thing, well, let me give an illustration of this as a way of a possibility. This is quite an old piece of video. Some of you will know it. It's called Powers of 10, but it makes the point that I want to talk about. Let's go on a quick tour of the universe. We'll start from a picnic in a park and expand the size of the picture by a factor of 10 every 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, you're going to be 10 times further away from the picnic in the park. You get the idea? As we move through the universe in this kind of way, we begin to see different perspectives. We see different levels of structure. We've lost any detail of the park. We see a city, a rather big expanse of water. We're not too sure what it is. Could it be an ocean? Well, as we begin to move to our Apollo rocket or space shuttle to get us out of the atmosphere, so you look back and see a great lake beginning to emerge, and the continent of North America. As we leave the Earth's atmosphere, for those of you who watch Star Trek, we're now traveling at warp factor 1 or something of that sort. And we look back on our beautiful home, the Earth, this blue planet. Now we're beginning to pick up speed. In a moment, you'll see a horizontal line extend across the screen. That'll be the true speed of light at this perspective. There it is. That is the orbit now of the moon, about 240,000 miles from the Earth. By the way, 240,000 miles is the distance that a certain Anglican priest called John Wesley traveled on horseback preaching the gospel. Funny coincidence. This is now the orbit of the Earth, and we'll remind ourselves that we're one planet in a solar system of planets. There's our close neighbors, the inner planets, rocky planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, our hot ball of hydrogen gas undergoing nuclear fusion, our sun. These are the orbits of the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, big gas giants. And then a very odd thing on the edges of our solar system, Pluto. Some people think it's a planet, some people think it's just a bit of rock that got lost. We're now moving through a vast cloud of comets called the Oort cloud. Millions and millions of comets left over from the way the solar system formed. It was a disturbance in these comets about 65 million years ago that something led to the dinosaur extinction. We've traveled quite a long way, but if you were to draw the constellations onto the sky, they would look exactly as they do from the surface of the Earth. That's because the background stars are so far away. We've changed scales now. We're talking about the distance that light would take 1 year to travel. We've done it in just a few seconds. At about 10 light years, we begin to see our sun as one star in a collection of stars, which of course is our Milky Way galaxy. A collection of stars and vast clouds of molecular hydrogen. These are maternity hospitals for stars. They'll give birth to 10,000 stars sometimes. And vast amounts of dust, too, in our galaxy. This is the Milky Way as it would look if we headed out from it. A spiral pattern of gas and dust and stars, containing 100 billion stars or so. From one side of the galaxy to the other is a distance of 100,000 light years. We're now going to look at the universe on the scale of galaxies. Each of these dots of light now will be a galaxy, typically containing 100 billion stars or so. Galaxies, of course, cluster. The clustering of galaxies is very important for us understanding some of the mechanisms in the way that the universe came about. That's the Virgo cluster. And how many galaxies are there in the universe? Well, it's of the order of 100 billion or so. So how many stars are there in the universe? Multiply 100 billion by 100 billion. And the answer is, of course, a lot. Now just play with that kind of image for a moment. Psalm 8, the image that the heavens are the work of God's fingers. Do you get that? That God is so great, they didn't have to use his whole arm. It's the work of his fingers. There's something here about getting a different perspective. Now we're moving back through a lot quicker because you saw the animation on the way out. And we're back to the orbit of the Earth. And if our aim is good enough and our parachute is big enough, then we find ourselves back in Chicago. And the folk that we left are having an afternoon snooze. You can tell by the way they're dressed what decade this movie was made in. You can tell by the way I'm dressed what decade I'm still stuck in. But we've looked at the universe on the very largest of scales. The really important things about modern physics is the way that the very large is connected to the very small. So let's continue our journey, this time making the size of the picture smaller by a factor of 10. Let's go into the man's hand and see what we can find. Well, at a resolution of 1 centimeter or 1 millimeter, you can look at the back of your own hand and begin to just about make the layers of skin. But let's make the picture smaller. These now beginning to emerge are blood vessels. If we make the picture smaller and go inside a blood vessel, that's a white blood cell. Inside the white blood cell is the cell nucleus. If we go inside the cell nucleus, we begin to see emerging the spiral coils of DNA, part of the stuff that makes us us. DNA, of course, is a complex molecule, and what we're going to look at is just a small part. In fact, we're going to look at one carbon atom in that molecule. The carbon atom is beginning to emerge at the center of the screen. And as we begin to move into the carbon atom, first of all, we encounter electrons. Now, in this animation, they're shown to be fuzzy. That's because of quantum theory. We haven't got time to do quantum theory this morning. Praise the Lord, everyone says. But we move through the electrons and to remind ourselves that the nucleus is very small indeed. In carbon's case, made up of protons and neutrons. It begins to emerge only now. And the protons and neutrons are made up of things called quarks. It's Difficult to represent quarks because you can't rip them out of the protons and neutrons. There's a particular force which keeps them stuck in there. And that's about the end of our tour of the universe as we have it at the moment. Now, many of you will know that piece of video. I've shown it many, many times. I still, even although it's very dated, it still fills me with a sense of awe. It still excites my imagination. And so my question to you is, in engaging science and faith, how do we engage not just the intellect, but also the imagination? Is that about the use of poetry and music? Is that about story and narrative? Is that allowing the wonder and the mystery of science to engage people's minds? And how do we do that? I think sometimes the science-religion dialogue becomes overly rational in terms of the way that we present it. But art and music, drama and poetry seem to me to be part of the tools that we have at our disposal. Next point. Something about how the science-religion dialogue should enrich our theology. And I want to give one or two illustrations of this from my own experience as an astrophysicist and a theologian. This isn't to close down the conversation, because for you there'll be many other things that excite you about science, but just to say what's important for me, if I may. The first is something about the importance of going back to Genesis. As Carl rightly said, I think there is a fear, certainly within evangelical churches, that one needs to avoid Genesis 1 because of the controversy about it. But I think we do a disservice to our folk if we don't engage with some of these difficult questions. And we need to engage with them with humility and yet with boldness. Creationism and the response to Darwin is a culture war. We had a very interesting experience in Britain just a few months ago. A leading scientist with a science education program run by the Royal Society in London, Professor Michael Rice, who's also an ordained Anglican clergyman, talked at the British Association of Science about how you couldn't simply keep hammering away at six-day creationism with some of the arguments of evidence for evolution. He said you had to understand the culture. You had to understand the biblical undergirdings of this type of belief. Dawkins and others were so outraged by this that they eventually got him sacked from his post with the Royal Society. But Michael Rice was absolutely right. You cannot engage six-day creationism, it seems to me, by simply arguing the science. Something much deeper is going on. And for me, that's about how people understand the first chapter of Genesis in particular. And my own six-day creationist friends, the dialogue that we have most fruitfully is when we sit down and we read Scripture together. And we engage Scripture directly, not through the lens of particular books, but actually reading the text together. And my plea has always been, let's preach Genesis 1. Let's teach Genesis 1. Let's allow our folks to engage, but not just with Genesis 1, of course, because the doctrine of creation is not confined to Genesis 1. And in the science-religion dialogue, often when we talk about beginnings, we're drawn back to simply Genesis 1. But what about Proverbs 8? What about the passages from Isaiah? What about the passages from the Psalms? And what about how creation is always linked to new creation? John 1, Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, indeed that flow right through to Revelation 21. But let's not avoid interacting with Genesis and helping people to read Scripture well and interpret it correctly. I think that enriches our theology. Secondly, I think some of these scientific insights allow us to rediscover that which is important in our own understanding of creation. And I think Stephen Hawking has been very important in this area for me. This is the history of the universe on one slide. Forgive me for being so bold and outrageous. But here we are at the moment. Our present age is 13.7 billion years. Some of us feel it more than others at times. 13.7 plus or minus 0.1 billion years. If we'd been talking about this just a few years ago, we would have been talking about the age of the universe between 10 and 15 billion years. But we're able to now trace the history of the universe back in time with fairly good confidence that we understand what the universe was like. So we think we know what the universe was like when it was only 1 million years old. This is a big jump from 13.7 billion. And by the way, of course, this isn't to scale. We think we know what the universe was like when it was only 1 second old. And in fact, we think we know what the universe was like when it was 10 to the minus 43 of a second old. That's a shorthand way of writing 1 divided by 10 followed by 42 zeroths of a second old. And the Big Bang model, of course, christened the Big Bang by Fred Hoyle because he didn't like the model. Hoyle said it had all the elegance of a girl jumping out of a cake at a party. He didn't like it at all, but it was a name that stuck. The Big Bang model says that the universe is very, very small. It begins to expand rapidly. As it expands rapidly, it cools. But our problem has been that at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, our current models of physics break down. We can't go any further. It's extremely frustrating to scientists. And the reason that our current models of physics break down, well, in order to explain this to you in the next 30 seconds, I need to explain both general relativity and quantum theory. So if you're not already asleep on that pillow, now is the time just to have a quick snooze. Let me put it like this. General relativity, discovered by Albert Einstein, deals with things on the very largest of scales in the universe. And wherever you apply it to galaxies or the universe itself, it works beautifully. Quantum theory, and here's one of its main proponents, Niels Bohr, deals with things on the very smallest of scales. It describes protons and electrons, and wherever you apply it, it works beautifully. Most of the time, these two work independently. However, there is one point in the universe where both say, this is my area. It's at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, when the whole universe is very, very small. At this point, general relativity says, this is about the whole universe. This is my area. Hold on, says quantum theory. The universe is very, very small. This is my area. And the trouble is that the two don't see eye to eye. That's why we need a quantum theory of gravity, a unified theory which will bring the two together. They break down. At that point, as I've said, things are very frustrating. In a famous quote from Robert Jastrow in God and the Astronomers, he talks about this frustration. It was written a few years ago, so sorry about the sexist language. Jastrow writes, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." Now, is this really where God comes in? Instead of that question mark, is this where we put God? Well, of course, it's an argument, the cosmological argument in temporal form, that has been used by many people over the years, Pius XII and great Oxford mathematician E.A. Milne. Milne wrote a great book on general relativity. At the end of his book on general relativity, concluded with the words, "The first cause of the universe is left for the reader to insert, but our story is incomplete without it." Is that a good argument for the existence of God? It's the argument that's used in popular conversation, which goes, if the universe began with a big bang, then who lit the blue touch paper of the explosion? Who set the whole thing off? Trouble is, I don't think it's a good argument at all. It's what Charles Coulson called the God of the gaps. If science has a gap in it, beware of inserting God as the explanation into the gap. For as that gap closes, so God is pushed out into irrelevancy. It's also an argument that's often led to deism rather than theism. The view that God simply starts the universe off and then goes for a cup of tea, not to have anything more to do with it. That's deism. And indeed, much Christian theology actually has the tinge of deism rather than theism. But the pictures in Scripture are not of a God who simply reaches out his hand and starts off the explosion. They're of God who holds the universe in the palm of his hand, keeping it in existence, moment by moment, sustaining the whole creative process. The images are not of God smashing a champagne bottle against the hull of the universe and pushing it out to sea, saying, "Cheerio, folks, see you on Judgment Day." The images are more of God as the one who keeps the whole thing afloat. In him all things cohere, says Paul in his letter to the Colossians. In him all things hold together. So the Christian understanding of creation is not about a God who interacts with the universe at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, but a God who sustains the universe moment by moment during its whole history. And that's why Hawking, I think, is important. Because Hawking has come along, and he hasn't succeeded yet, but he's saying, let me try and find a mechanism which fills in this gap. Let me see if I have a quantum theory of gravity. It might have these kind of features to it. And this might explain how the universe begins. At this point, I think we are reminded that the Christian doctrine of creation is not about God of the gaps or about a deistic creator, but that we should welcome Hawking and others' work in filling in just another part of the story. There are still questions about where the laws of physics themselves come from and what the purpose of the universe is. But Hawking is to be welcomed and a reminder of what the doctrine of creation is about. Third, there's something, I think, which is important for me in terms of the end of the universe, too. In 1999, the whole of the physics world was rocked by what became known as the accelerating universe. Work by Brian Schmidt and Adam Rice and Saul Perlmutter said that the universe wasn't slowing down in its expansion, but was accelerating in its expansion. And unfortunately, its end would then be an accelerated heat death as the universe cools and all stars become black holes and there's little light and the temperature goes down. At that point, the universe is destined to futility. And at that point, I think then Christian theology is reminded that the hope that we have is about a new heaven and a new earth. The centrality in the New Testament of the doctrine of new creation. The importance of the physicality, or what Tom Wright in his most recent books calls the transphysical. That God's purposes are to transform heaven and earth. That this isn't about a dualism between the body and the soul, but about resurrection and transformation of the whole created order. I'm reminded by that. I'm beginning to run out of time, so let me just mention another area. and that is SETI, and particularly being human in the universe. Paul Davis, a number of years ago, wrote a very interesting book called Are We Alone? And Paul said that the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence would pose a fundamental problem for Christian belief. He talked about it not as some have done, that God is an alien, the sense that our religious records are about visitations by aliens. He didn't talk about it. But he did say that Christian faith specifically cannot cope with aliens for 4 reasons. He said, you Christians will not be able to understand the nature of human beings, for you think you are special because you are alone in the universe. I think Paul is wrong on that. Colin Russell, historian of science, pointed out a number of years ago that in fact Christians were some of the first people to speculate about life on other planets. Why? Because they saw that what was special about being human was not about their place in the universe, but about the gift of relationship, intimate relationship with God. Then Paul says, you Christians wouldn't be able to understand creation. And here, even a distinguished commentator like Paul Davis falls into believing that most Christians are 6-day creationists. It seems to me that God could create in lots of different ways. In fact, we see diversity in the natural world. It wouldn't surprise me if there were other life forms elsewhere in the universe. And then Paul says that you Christians wouldn't be able to cope with super advanced alien religions, that these aliens would come and bring with them new philosophy, completely misunderstanding the nature of faith and the nature of revelation. However, his 4th criticism, I think, is something worth taking seriously. And that is, he says, you Christians would need to think more about the nature of the incarnation. And I think he's right in that. It begins a conversation which is about the nature of the incarnation, whether God would become incarnate in little green flesh elsewhere in the universe, or whether the Calvary event is for all in the universe. Now, this may be speculation, but it begins to tease out some of the theological problems and some of the theological opportunities. And I talk about, going back to Genesis, I talk about Stephen Hawking, I talk about SETI, I talk about the end of the universe as illustrations of what John Polkinghorne would say are bottom-up approaches to engaging people in science and faith. Polkinghorne says that you can talk about science and faith from a philosophical perspective, laying out how the two are related and all the rest of it. But he says the way to engage people is to start from a bottom-up process. Take the specific issue, Big Bang, SETI, evolution, and begin to tease out the issues of science and faith from within that specific issue. Do you get the point? That's the bottom-up approach. And in that way, I think it enriches our theology. Last couple of minutes. Is that right, Larry? I've just got a couple of minutes. Are we all right? Okay. Final point, and that's about how do we engage science. I think there's a real need within our churches to affirm science as a gift, to see science as a Christian vocation, to rediscover the history of science. Sometimes it's overplayed, but a number of historians have, I think, rightly pointed out the importance of the Christian worldview for the growth of science as we have it. Because Christians believe that the universe was created freely by God, you have to look at the universe in order to understand what it's about, the importance of observation. Because God was a God of order, there should be consistencies or laws in the universe. Because we were made in the image of God, we had optimism that we would understand that order. Because there was one God, there should be consistency of the laws throughout the universe. And because we didn't fear the gods of nature, we could do experiments. Sometimes this is overplayed, but I think sometimes we need to reclaim the Christian heritage of science and allow Christians to understand that and rejoice in it. And then I think there's something about subverting scientism, subverting that conflict model, going back to talk about the limits of science and the nature of science. And then I think there's something about taking time to listen in those areas where popular science is engaged. Carl quite rightly pointed out the importance of The Simpsons. Let me take you to something slightly different, and that is Star Wars. Underneath Star Wars, the hype, the merchandising, the special effects, the story, is something about the engagement of science and faith. Lucas puts it in terms of the Force. And what he's doing with the Force is saying, is there more to the universe than just the science and technology? He loves the science and technology, but he's asking, is there more to it? And so he writes, I would hesitate to call the Force God. It's designed primarily to make young people think about mystery. Not to say, here's the answer. It's to say, think about this for a second. Is there a God? What does God look like? What does God sound like? What does God feel like? How do we relate to God? If we're prepared to listen in certain areas of popular culture, we find questions, maybe not answers, but questions. What bridges can we build, whether it be with anthropic balances, as I talked about last night, whether it be about SETI and some of the themes there. Let's use the visuals to engage people's imagination. And one final thing, and that is enjoy. In engaging people in science and faith, it's about our own enjoyment that communicates. A British evangelist called David Watson once said to preachers, never be tempted to buy one of those books entitled 300 Jokes to Tell During a Sermon. He said, if you are tempted and you do fall to buy that kind of book, then only use the jokes that make you laugh out loud when you read them. Because however good the joke is, unless it grips you, unless you get a sense of enjoyment out of it, it'll never communicate to those around. I've gone over time, forgive me. Let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson and Dr. Giberson.